Welcome to the Blockcrunch podcast, the go-to podcast for investors and builders in crypto. And before we get started, just a reminder for you guys out there, the Blockcrunch podcast is intended for informational purposes only. Neither the host nor its guests are licensed financial advisors, and nothing discussed should be construed as financial advice. Views held by Blockcrunch's guests are their own, and sponsorship messages do not constitute financial advice or endorsement. With that out of the way, let's jump right in. Now, before we get started with today's episode, I've got some great news for you. Now, a lot of you have been asking for how I analyze projects that I bring on the show. That's why I decided to create Blockcrunch VIP to share with you all the heavy research that goes on behind the scenes. Now, every week or so, our team prepares an in-depth research memo with things like sector analysis, technical concepts made simple, in-depth competitor breakdown, and even interactive models, so you can learn about the most important projects before they become important. And our team is putting in hours every week scouring Discord, Twitter, forums, and blogs to help you get an edge in crypto and understand the latest projects and themes at the deepest levels that goes way beyond just an interview. Now, in addition, we'll also host exclusive AMAs with myself to answer any of your questions. So all of these are only available to Blockcrunch VIP subscribers. And the good news is that while our interviews will always be free, the VIP tier costs less than one coffee a day. So head on over to theblockcrunch.com/VIP or click the link in the show notes below to sign up. All right, hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Blockcrunch podcast. Now this week we have a very, very special episode because recently my angel collective Tangent announced our first investment after our public launch. And alongside funds like Multicoin Capital, Delphi Digital, and Coinbase Ventures, we invested in a new exciting project called Say. And it's the only layer 1 blockchain right now that's optimized for DeFi, and they call themselves a sector-specific blockchain, which represents a really exciting new paradigm, which we're going to talk about. Now, even before going live, more than 20 projects have committed to building on Say, and I'm really excited to have Jay from the Say team on the show to chat today. So today, we're going to break down why projects are so excited about Say, what's so special about them, and what it means for the DeFi and broader crypto ecosystem to have the emergence of sector-specific chains. So Jay, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on, Jason. Excited to do a deep dive into Say.
Yeah, definitely. Now, before we get into that, I know you have a very interesting background and very relevant to what you're building right now. So can you walk us through how your previous gigs led you to building Say?
Absolutely. Yeah. So about me, my name is Jay. I'm a co-founder for Say and I lead engineering. I personally got into crypto back in 2017. At that time, my roommate was going through Binance Launchpad, so we worked on a few different projects together. And afterwards, I ended up joining Robinhood. So I spent almost 4 years over there, saw the company 10x, and I will say it was definitely a very interesting experience. One thing that Robinhood has done really well is they've been able to get retail to start trading options, right? No one else has been able to do that. No one in traditional finance, no one in DeFi, but Robinhood successfully cracked that puzzle. So a lot of interesting takeaways from that. On the other hand, the way that they handled Jamie last year was complete mess. I'm sure you and a lot of the other listeners were following along, but from an external side, it was a PR disaster. As an insider as well, it was very messy. And whenever you have these opaque systems where there's decision makers just deciding what to do things without anyone else really knowing what's going on, that tends to have things just blow up. And we saw that most recently with 3AC as well. So because of that, last year, my co-founder Jeff and I, we decided it'd be interesting to start building something like Robinhood, except building it on-chain in a trustless and permissionless manner. So we started building a derivatives exchange initially. And that led to us looking into every layer 1, every layer 2, and all the other infrastructure that could potentially be used to build a DEX. And we ultimately came to the conclusion that L1s are holding back exchanges today. First of all, there's no DEX optimizations. Secondly, they all have congestion issues, which is tolerable if you're an NFT collection, but catastrophically bad if you're an order book. And they're also still a tad bit too slow, even the newer ones like Aptos and Sui. And this isn't really even the fault of the layer 1s themselves. This is just because exchanges are unique types of applications that have really high throughput and latency requirements. So because of that, we started building Say, which is an L1 that's optimized for trading. And our objective is to help give exchanges an unfair advantage.
That's a really good point and a very bold statement, given how many exchanges already exist on different chains, both layer 1s and layers 2 alike. Now, for example, in Solana, they have their own ecosystem of exchanges with Serum and all that. And then on Arbitrum and Optimism, there's their own cluster of exchanges as well. So the claim you're making is that these chains are simply not ready to support exchanges specifically at scale and at maturity when there are way more users than they have today. So I guess just to dive into that, what do you think is missing in these chains that people have already built exchanges on? And what is happening when people use these exchanges that cause you to come upon this discovery that made you say, hey, we need to completely rehaul the layer ones built for exchanges?
Yeah, so exchanges right now, they are the killer application in crypto. And I mean, this extends past just order books and AMMs. This is also true for NFTs and games because what comes out of NFTs and games, it's essentially just tokens, whether they're fungible or non-fungible tokens. And the primary utility for these tokens right now, the main reason people have them is for speculation, right? Like the only reason people hold these tokens for a large degree is to be able to trade them. And this also means that exchanges are basically required for every single application in crypto to work. And it's ironic because right now exchanges are also one of the most underserved applications in crypto right now. They all have very stringent requirements around performance and reliability and liveness. And current infrastructure just does not support that, whether it's layer ones or whether it's layer twos, such as all the ones you mentioned, like Arbitrum and Optimism on Ethereum. And this basically means that all of the exchanges that have taken off right now, they've done so in spite of the underlying layer one, not because of it. So what we're doing today is we're optimizing every single layer of the stack to help give exchanges the best kind of possible performance that they would need to be able to help them scale moving forward.
And before we dive into the weeds, just at a kind of high level, what are the trade offs that you guys are making to make this work? Now, for instance, with Solana, I think a lot of the vision early on was quite similar because I remember in our first interview with Solana back in 2018 or 19, they were talking about building a decentralized NASDAQ. And then the trade off they were willing to make is centralization because they made it harder for people to validate for the chain because it was very expensive to run nodes and their hardware intensive setups to validate the chain were just very costly. Is that a similar trade off that you guys are making? Is it just harder for people to validate the chain, which is why it's faster?
Yeah, there's a few different things that we're doing. So first of all, around the decentralization front, we are going to have a smaller validator set than a chain like Ethereum, for example. So realistically, when we launch on mainnet, we're going to have somewhere around 20 to 50 validators. And we think that this is perfectly fine. In the future, we'll try to kind of decentralize it even more. But at the start, we think that it doesn't really matter. Like, there's not much of a difference between, let's say, 30 validators and like 3,000 validators, because there ends up being a lot of centralization of stake and voting power anyway. Even in like Ethereum's case, for example, right now, you have thousands and thousands of validators, but like Lido and Coinbase end up having a lion's share of that voting power anyway. So that's the first kind of thing that we're doing. The second thing that we're doing is tied to which applications are actually allowed to launch on Say. So right now, only DeFi focused applications are allowed to launch on Say. So there's not going to be any like NFT mints, for example, that are happening on the core Say chain. We anticipate that assets from NFTs and games will be created either on rollups or on other chains entirely, and then they'll be bridged over, and then they'll be able to make use of the underlying infrastructure. And the last thing that we've done that really benefits exchanges is we've made a bunch of changes to the chain itself. So first of all, we have a native order matching engine, which helps exchanges scale. And this also helps with preventing front running to a degree, and it also helps with improving UX for market makers. The second thing that we've done is we've changed the consensus layer. So Say is built with Cosmos and Tendermint, but we basically forked Cosmos and Tendermint at this point. We've changed the way that block propagation works, we've changed the way that block processing works, and we've termed this twin turbo consensus. So this helps substantially improve performance as well. And the last thing that we've done is we've added in parallelization. So we have market-based parallelization right now, and we're currently the only Cosmos chain to make use of parallelization. So through a combination of all these trade-offs, we're able to achieve around 22,000 orders per second that we're able to process with around 450 millisecond block time. So those are the primary trade-offs we ended up making.
Got it. We're going to definitely dive deeper into that later. But for now, I'm curious in terms of market timing as well, because obviously, with any startups, a really important part of their success is how they time the market. And I think right now, a lot of people in the US, especially, are very scared of building in DeFi because of these 3 or 4 letter agencies that are coming after us with a chainsaw, but not with a scalpel. So I'm very curious, what gives you the conviction to build this right now? And why is now the right time to build a chain that's seemingly targeting DeFi first?
Yeah, it's actually really ironic because this is quite possibly the best time to be building layer one chain. So just from the team side, right? Like there's no longer any noise, there's no longer any distractions. We can all just put our heads down and get to work and build the chain. And from an ecosystem side as well, before there were a lot more mercenary founders that were there that are just trying to take advantage of whatever the market dynamics were because it was a bull cycle. Right now, given that we're in the middle of a bear cycle, there's much more mission-driven founders. And the single thing that they're trying to decide on is what is the best layer one that we can go to that'll allow our exchange to be built in the best possible way. Like, what are the technical advantages? And they don't get distracted as much by all the hype and all the kind of money that was flowing through the ecosystem, let's say a year ago. So because of that, right now, there's a lot of founders that are becoming more and more interested in Say than there probably would have been during the bull cycle. So at this point, we've been able to get over 60 ecosystem apps that are building on top of Say. I think the last time that we chatted was around 20. That was a couple of months ago. At this point, it's over 60 ecosystem apps. And this has all been organic, right? We haven't been giving away any money in grants. It's just founders that have been looking into what ecosystems to be building on, and Say ended up becoming the best choice for in their eyes.
So just to clarify, will all the applications on Say just be exchanges? Like how many exchanges do we actually need on one chain?
Yeah, so there's basically every single flavor of DeFi application that is building on top of Say right now. So when we initially got started with this, the first obvious use case was to build an order book based exchange on top of Say because there's a native order matching engine, right? So we originally got a few different order book based exchanges that are interested in building on Say. And then afterwards, it became very clear that as soon as you have, there's very strong network effects in any kind of DeFi ecosystem, right? As soon as you have some applications that are drawing in users in TVL, or even if there's the perception that this is going to be a chain that draws in users in TVL, it suddenly becomes extremely, extremely strategic to start building other applications in that same ecosystem. Because that same TVL, those same set of users can then be used to drive volume towards other applications that are building on top. So at this point, there's a very vibrant ecosystem of essentially every flavor of DeFi application building on Say. So it started off with order book exchanges, then there ended up being AMMs and a lot of the other infrastructure you would see in any other DeFi ecosystem starting to build on Say as well.
Yeah, I would love to dive into that because that ties into the topic of sector-specific chains and not app chains. Now, with the recent Cosmos hype, a lot of people have been looking into app chains, and we've seen projects like DYDX, which created the very successful decentralized exchange, now verticalizing and creating their own layer one via Cosmos, which likely will only support the DYDX app itself. And then projects like Injective also started as an exchange and are now verticalizing into their own app chain. So Say is slightly different because it's not just one exchange. It's one sector specific layer one built for a variety of different dApps in the same vertical. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah. So if you look at the distribution of layer ones right now, there's basically two extremes. On one hand, you have application specific chains like DYDX and Osmosis. And on the other hand, you have general purpose chains like Ethereum and Solana. And they both have their own set of benefits. General purpose chains, the biggest benefit is around social coordination. You're able to have an ecosystem of projects that are all building together and they're all on the same team. And with application specific chains, you benefit from customizability. So you're able to take every single layer of the stack and customize it to exactly what you want. We think the area in between is the most interesting. So not quite general purpose, not quite application specific, but rather use case specific. And from this approach, you end up benefiting from both the social coordination aspect. So in the case of Say, we can have different teams that are basically all part of the same family that all help the Say ecosystem succeed. It also benefits from having composable transactions. So you can have atomic transactions that span multiple projects, which you don't get if you have separate app chains that are trying to interact with each other. But on the other hand, we also benefit from the customizability. So we're able to change the consensus layer. We're able to add a native order matching engine, which leads to the best possible performance for exchanges. And this is kind of mirroring what happened in Web 2 as well. A blockchain is essentially just a distributed database, right? So if you look at the database industry, it started off very general purpose as well. You had solutions like Oracle that everyone could be using, and then gradually became more and more specialized. So now you have solutions like Databricks Warehouse that is tailor-made for AI and ML. And we think something similar is going to be happening in crypto. Starting off with very general purpose blockchains like Ethereum, we think they're going to start becoming more and more specialized, for example, with Say. So yeah, I mean, this use case specific approach we think is going to be the most interesting. It's going to lead to a lot of novel types of applications just because of the way that things are customized and because of the composable nature of the chain as well.
Well, that's a really, really interesting analogy, Databricks for L1s. So I'd love to go outside of the context of Say a little bit, or maybe you have some examples of other types of L1s that are optimized for other types of use cases that you foresee coming in maybe the next few years.
In terms of other types of use cases, I mean, gaming would be one pretty interesting one. But I think ironically, Terra is the best example of another chain that was a use case specific chain that ended up taking off, right? Putting aside the fact that Terra's stablecoin mechanism ended up not really holding up, it was a use case specific chain, and its use case at that time was a stablecoin. And it did benefit from having the entire lunatic community that was able to build up on top of it. And I mean, that's one of the biggest reasons why Terra was able to succeed, right? Like there was this entire community that was just very, very strongly supporting it. And then it was also able to make changes at the chain level to be able to create the stablecoin, have all of the mechanisms that supported it. So I think Choi would be one of the most interesting examples of a chain that did something similar that was able to take off.
Yes, and I did want to kind of touch on Terra and Serum and these projects with somewhat similar visions later on. But before that, let's rewind a little bit here because I think a lot of our listeners that are more technical are interested in how Say actually works under the hood. And I know you guys recently just launched your white paper as well, which we can link in the show notes below. So let's start with this idea of an on chain order book. So, core to Say is this idea of having an order book completely on chain. That's very, very different from what, say, DYDX is doing, which is hosting all of the orders off chain. So let's just kick us off by discussing why is having this order book on chain so important?
Yeah, so I think that there's two main reasons. The first reason is around trust, and this largely comes from my experience at Robinhood. If you have anything that's off chain, then that just leads to issues where you have to make trust assumptions around censorship and around, I mean, in the case of crypto, like around censorship, around the ordering of transactions, around MEV, that the people who are maintaining these off-chain servers are not going to take advantage of you, right? And I don't think those are the right, like you can't always assume that people are going to be trustworthy, and anything that's centralized is going to run into issues with that. Like even DYDX v4, they have a decentralized off-chain order book, and I would argue that that's going to lead to greater opportunities for MEV because now each of these validators is maintaining their own state of the order book. The second big reason is around composability. So if you have something that is off-chain, you are not going to be able to have composable atomic transactions with something that's on-chain. Like you can't have an on-chain transaction happen that is able to issue an HTTP request off-chain that is then able to do something on this off-chain order book and then have something happen on-chain again. So you miss out on composability. And I would make the argument that composability is one of the biggest differentiators between DeFi and what's happening in traditional finance. Like the innovation that's going to happen in DeFi is largely going to be because things are able to move very, very quickly and everyone is able to build on top of everyone else in a permissionless manner. Whereas in traditional finance, you need to have lengthy negotiations to be able to work with other parties. Like I saw at Robinhood how everything, like for something to launch, it would take the better part of 9 months. Even if the engineering part of it might only take like a month or two. So I think those are the bigger reasons that I'm not super bullish on any kind of off-chain approach. I think that having everything be on-chain whenever possible is going to lead to just a better user experience, and you can have better trust assumptions, and it's also going to be more composable.
Now, I know these things are kind of hard to predict, but do you foresee any types of use cases that would, outside of trading, that would benefit from an on-chain order book with its composability?
I think that, I mean, right now, I don't have any ideas off the top of my mind, but whenever you have this system where anyone can permissionlessly play around with it and start building on top of it, I think that there will be a lot of interesting use cases that come up in the future.
Yeah, actually, on that line of thought, I think many people at first, when we were kind of discussing Say or learning about Say, a lot of people seem to mistake it for a DEX itself. But now, I think the better way to describe it is an L1 for people to build exchanges or applications like exchanges. So, just to clarify on that, what other use cases are there besides perpetual swaps exchanges, futures exchanges? Can you maybe talk a little bit about some of the projects that have committed to building on Say that are not exchanges?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, yeah, originally we started off mainly seeing exchanges. At this point, we've started seeing a lot of other applications building on top of Say as well. So there's a lot of the normal stuff you would see on other layer ones, like, for example, liquid staking providers, different types of wallet providers, bridges, etc. One of the projects that I'm very interested in right now is Nitro. So Nitro is an optimistic rollup with the Solana execution environment that's building on top of Say. And Solana teams are interested in coming over to the Cosmos ecosystem, but they don't want to take their smart contracts and then have to rewrite them in a different type of, I guess, if you're coming to Cosmos, you typically have to write it in CosmWasm, so you'd have to rewrite your contracts in a different framework based in Rust as well. So this is, I think, going to be a really interesting experiment because there are a lot of Solana teams that would come over to the Cosmos ecosystem if they didn't need to rewrite their smart contracts. And there's a lot of other people that are diehard Solana developers that really love the SVM, and they just want to be able to write all of their code in Solana. So this is one of the projects that I'm pretty interested in, and it's making use of Say for data availability and for settlement. And in the future, I think there might be more examples of projects like this that come over to chains like Say, where they can have a lot of stuff happening off chain, and then they can take assets that are there on those chains and bring them over to Say to start trading them, depending on what their use cases are. And I think this is going to be particularly interesting for gaming, because for gaming, a lot of the stuff doesn't need to be happening on chain. So you can have a roll up that is purely for gaming and then have data availability settlement happen on a chain like Say. And then you can take the fungible and non-fungible tokens that get created from this in-game economy, bring them over to Say, and then start trading them on an order book that's going to be more scalable than what you would probably see on that off-chain rollup.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I love that you brought up the gaming use case as well, because gaming is one of those things that probably require quite high throughput, especially if you put more and more of it on chain. And actually, depending on what the game is, probably. But so far, it seems like Say is able to offer, first of all, a composable and on chain order book, and number two, a very, very high throughput. So I guess over the long term, what would you say is the thing that differentiates Say? Is it the magnitude of how fast you can provide a throughput? Or is it kind of major features that you foresee as points of differentiation down the line?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on who you're comparing, say, to. So if we look at, let's say you're comparing to Solana, or any other general purpose layer one, the biggest differentiators are going to end up being the native order matching engine, which is going to allow exchanges to scale much better on, say, than they're going to be able to scale on any kind of general purpose chain. In the case of general purpose chains, like take Serum, for example, Serum is a series of smart contracts that's built on Solana, which is general purpose L1. So Serum inherits all of the, I guess, issues that Solana runs into. So these issues would be around, for example, outages happening, network congestion, and even their accounts model, which only allows you to update, I think, 35 accounts per transaction, which results in Serum's case, for example, they have this concept of crank turning, which means that you need to be turning the crank, and it needs 3 separate transactions for an order to get placed, then matched, and then filled. And you need someone like Alameda running an off-chain process to be turning this crank. So Serum inherits all of the underlying limitations of Solana without actually being able to get Solana as a core chain to make any changes, right? So Serum can go to Anatoly and be like, yo, I want these changes to be made that are going to be beneficial only for Serum, that are going to come at the expense of the other projects that are building on top of Solana. Like, that is just not going to happen. Whereas in the case of Say, we're custom built for exchanges. So all of those things that would lead to better performance for exchanges, we're trying to add those in right now. And then in the future, we anticipate that the community would be very receptive to making changes to the base layer that'll lead to exchanges having better performance. The second long-term differentiator between Say and general purpose chains is going to be the permissioned nature of the chain. Specifically, only DeFi related applications are going to be able to deploy on top of Say. So what this means is you're not going to have like NFT mint, for example, happening on Say. So that's going to long-term lead to better performance on the core chain as well.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned a bit about the permissioned process for launching contracts on Say. So I think listeners might get a little bit confused about what that means, and they might think that maybe Say is centralized, that you guys are signing off on what projects can build on Say or launch on Say. So can you clarify on that a bit?
It's completely permissionless for normal users to come and interact with Say. The only point where it's permissioned is when you want to be deploying a smart contract. So in that case, you're going to be submitting a governance proposal, and then governance will be voting on whether or not your smart contract should be allowed to deploy on top of Say or not. So once that governance vote goes through, assuming it passes, then your smart contract will be able to handle traffic on Say, and then people can start routing transactions to that smart contract. So that's the kind of permissioned deployment process. And I guess semi-permissioned is more correct because you're having governance that is making these decisions.
Just to play devil's advocate here, because I don't want to make it too easy for you, are you worried that that would create too much friction for developers to onboard? Because I think that's somewhat similar to what we saw in the Polkadot ecosystem, where they required developers to participate in these auctions for slots, which are called parachains, in order for them to have access to block space. And it ended up being just way too much friction versus Ethereum or Cosmos, where I can just write a contract and deploy it. But obviously, I have to pay a bit of gas. But at least I can deploy the contract today. So, how do you guys think about adding this friction for developers to deploy onto Say?
Polkadot ends up being a separate type of issue altogether because you need to be paying a lot of money to be able to participate over here. There's a certain upper bound for how many different parachains are allowed to exist. And then you also have to adhere to the limitations of whatever the validator set is. So, for example, in Polkadot's case, they have around 6-second block times. You're forced to inherit that 6-second block time as well, and you have to use the same validator set. In the case of what we're doing right now, I would say, like, given that we already have over 60 teams that are aware of this, that are building on, say, ahead of the mainnet launch, we don't foresee that. We don't actually think that's a significant problem. And I think that's because what is core to the idea of Say is being DeFi focused. So teams understand that as long as what they're building is DeFi focused, governance is going to be very receptive to that. And that's what the community in general, that's a set sentiment of the community in general as well. So I agree that it's going to not be as easy as building on Ethereum. I would also make the argument that that's a good thing, because only really good teams are going to want to start building on Say, rather than trying to have just random garbage projects that they try to deploy, right? Before this call started, we were talking about like how there's a lot of Cosmos developers that were going to Medellin for Cosmoverse, and that ended up being a really high quality conference because there was a certain amount of friction to actually end up going there, right? Like not everyone necessarily wants to go to Medellin, and I'd make the argument in this case that having that small amount of friction actually does lead to a better set of projects that end up deploying on Say.
Yeah, I love that thesis because I recently wrote a thread that I got quite a few responses, and basically I was talking about how important it is for L1s to curate their culture from day one. Because if you're just handing out a lot of VC money and making it very, very easy for them to just get infinite cash from VCs in that ecosystem, you end up attracting a lot of trash and a lot of noise and people who are, sibling a lot of projects under, a pseudonymous name and then hopping over to the other ecosystem after they've bled this one dry. And we saw that with many, many layer one ecosystem out there. I'm not going to try to name specific ones. I think you can probably infer which ones these are. And there's so many examples of that. So I think curating that culture from day one is going to be extremely important. And now I'd love to kind of talk about the consensus part as well, just to kind of wrap up the technical part of the discussion. Because if you look at other L1s out there, like Solana or Avalanche, they're basically completely reinventing their own consensus or rolling up their own consensus mechanisms. So when you guys were deciding to build Say, how did you decide to use Tendermint or fork Tendermint versus trying to create something completely new from scratch?
So when we got started, we wanted to make use of the Cosmos SDK in Tendermint, first of all, because it's completely customizable, and secondly, because it's extremely modular. So it allows us to get started as quickly as we can. And then afterwards, we can replace certain parts of it to lead to better performance based off what we want. So rather than spending 3 years in R&D trying to get something up off the ground, we can spend 3 months getting a chain built, and then afterwards incrementally make changes that lead to better and better performance. That's the approach that we took. When we originally got started, we added in the native order matching engine, and then afterwards we started making changes at the consensus level, right? So right now we have twin turbo consensus. This means that we've changed the way that block propagation works to make it faster. We've changed the way that block processing works so that we can optimistically start processing blocks, which also improves the performance of the chain itself. So we're able to make changes at the consensus level as well as needed. I would also make the argument that, like right now, Say has instant finality. Whereas other chains like Solana and Ethereum, they have probabilistic finality. And I'd make the argument that instant finality is better, and it's hard to get a better algorithm for instant finality than what Tendermint has right now. And yes, there are some limitations of Tendermint. For example, you have to go through multiple rounds of voting before a block is committed. So there ends up being some additional network latency tied to that. But if you're aiming for instant finality, where blocks, as soon as there's consensus on it, the blocks are finalized and there's not going to be any reorgs or forks happening, then I think Tendermint is one of the best approaches out there right now.
Hey guys, I'm really excited to tell you more about one of my favorite products in crypto right now, DYDX. This is a team I've known since 2018, and they've built one of the best exchange venues out there that also happens to be decentralized and mobile friendly. Now listen until the end because there's an opportunity for savvy traders out there as well. And here are just a few reasons why I like DYDX over other exchanges. First, it's very liquid. It processes $2 to $3 billion every day in volume and has 35 perpetual swaps as of this recording, which means you can trade things like Ethereum, Bitcoin, Doge, Solana, and most of the most popular assets with up to 20x leverage in the venue today. Now second, it's also extremely cheap, and if you're down bad from the bear market, you don't have to worry about gas fees at all because there is no gas fee on Starkware Layer 2 where DYDX is built on. Now that brings me to my next point as well. It's incredibly fast. Unlike other layer 2 and high-speed DEXs, you don't actually have to wait to withdraw your assets anymore. And as an additional point, by using Starkware, DYDX also provides user with increased security and privacy. And my personal favorite feature is the cross-margin feature, which means I can seed one account with USDC and trade across multiple markets from there without needing to start sub-accounts because I really hate managing so many different sub-accounts. And their iOS mobile app is also live right now, and it's amazing because it's compatible with MetaMask, Coinbase Wallet, Coin98, Huobi Wallet, and a lot of the most popular mobile wallets out there. And it's available for people outside of the US or sanctioned countries today. And one last thing, one exciting opportunity is their competitions. The most recent tier in the $10,000 equity tier have won over $95,000 in rewards. And you can get started with as low as $500 in equity to compete for prizes. So if you're already trading, might as well get paid to do it. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend that you head on over to dydx.exchange to learn more. And I thank them for sponsoring this episode. And I'd love to touch on block processing as well, because I remember one of the first conversations that we had, you guys mentioned this idea of optimistic block processing, which was supposed to decrease block latency by quite a bit. So can you explain a little bit for our listeners who may not be familiar with that concept?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that blocks are processed right now with like vanilla Tendermint and Cosmos SDK is that a validator will send out a block or a block proposer will send out a block to different validators. The validator will receive the block, they'll run validity checks on it, and then they will not do anything with that block in terms of processing it for multiple rounds of voting. So there will be a pre-vote step where they just hold on to the block and don't do anything with it. Then there'll be a pre-commit step where they again don't do anything with it. And then after they vote for pre-commit, that's when they'll actually start processing the block. And this approach makes sense because you don't necessarily want to be making assumptions about whether or not the block is going to be approved, especially if you think that it's going to be a highly kind of adversarial environment where there's a lot of Byzantine nodes or nodes that are going down all the time, then these assumptions make sense. But realistically, what ends up happening is there are no Byzantine nodes in the network. Most of the time, nodes are not acting maliciously at all. They're not proposing any invalid blocks. So the first block that is proposed is the one that ends up getting approved. So taking that into consideration, we decided that it makes sense to be optimistic. And rather than waiting after the pre-commit step to start processing a block, we start processing a block as soon as it's received and the initial validity checks are done being run. So what ends up happening is that while doing the pre-vote and pre-commit step, we are in parallel processing the block as well, which leads to improved performance. So what we ended up noticing is this led to around a 33% improvement in throughput and around a 25% improvement in latency because we're able to start processing these blocks sooner. And like the main question becomes like, what happens if the block ends up being rejected? Well, what is actually happening under the hood is we're updating a candidate state. So what this means is we're updating a state that is not the actual core state of the blockchain on each validator. So if for whatever reason that optimistic proposal needs to be rejected, then that candidate state will just be discarded, and then we'll be able to go on to the next round in that particular height of voting. And then from the second round onwards at any given height, we just don't optimistically process it, and we'll start optimistically processing again from the next height.
And I think this ties really nicely into a discussion about MEV, which you guys have a lot of ideas around. So can you talk about how you guys are distributing MEV, or maybe take a step back, even explain just what MEV is in the context of SEI and what you guys are trying to do with it?
Absolutely. So MEV stands for maximal extractable value. This refers to the value that validators can get if they basically are able to order transactions in a way such that their transactions are able to either go first or go last, or basically be in some ordering. So in the context of SEI, there's a few different ways that validators could profit off of this. One of these is through a negative way called front running. An example of front running would be, let's say that there's an AMM on SEI, and Jason, you submit a order to purchase something off that AMM. Then what they'll do is they will bump up the price of that of whatever is there on the AMM, and then afterwards they will sell that to you. So they end up making money off of that at your expense. So that's front running. That's actually one thing that we have the ability to largely prevent for order book related transactions. And we're using this mechanism called frequent batch auctioning, which is built in to the chain itself in the native order matching engine. So the way that frequent batch auctioning works is that at the end of a block, every single market order for any kind of order book related transaction will be aggregated, and it'll all be executed at the same uniform clearing price. So to give you an example, let's say that the order book has two orders on it, one for $10, the second one for $11, and then two market orders come in. What would normally happen without frequent batch auctioning is the first one will get filled for $10, second one will get filled for $11. But with frequent batch auctioning, they'll both get filled at $10.50. So this leads to price fairness within the block. It also means that the ordering within the block no longer matters. So this is something that works specifically for order book related transactions within the scope of a block. But for any other type of transaction, right? Like for AMM related transactions, this doesn't work. It also doesn't work for multi-block MEV. For example, if a validator sees, Jason, that you're submitting a market order, then it'll just not include your transaction in block one, and it'll just place a market order itself to buy that asset. Then in block two, let's say that it knows who the block proposer is, it's colluding with the block two block proposer, then it'll be able to place a limit order to be selling that specific asset. And then in block three, that's when your market order will actually go through. So if there's collusion happening and the block proposers are trying to do multi-block strategies, then it technically is possible for them to do front running as well. So that's the first type. The second type and third type are a lot simpler. It's like liquidations and ARBs. So with liquidations, there might be, let's say there's a perpetuals exchange on say, and you're holding a position and that position is now underwater. Then someone will buy that position and then they'll be able to sell it on the market. They'll basically be able to buy your collateral and then they'll sell that collateral on the market for ideally to make some kind of profit. And then with ARBs, there's like, let's say there's two different order books that are both selling the same type of asset. Then you'd be able to buy it, and the order books have the assets out of sync. So one is selling the asset for $10, the second one is selling it for $15. Then you'd be able to buy it from the $10 order book and sell it to the $15 order book. So those are the different types of MEVs that we anticipate to be happening on say. We think that rather than trying to completely solve this, which is, from our viewpoint, impossible to do right now, it makes more sense to have some kind of MEV redistribution strategy. So what I mean by this is that we're going to have some kind of similar setup to Flashbots that will be built into the chain itself, where searchers or people that identify ARB opportunities and liquidation opportunities will be able to submit bids to an off-chain node. And then there will be an auction that happens where whoever is submitting the highest price bid will be able to win that liquidation or that ARB. And then that's what will get submitted to the chain. So then you'll be able to privately make sure that your transaction ends up winning. So what ends up happening in the longer term is that there's going to be a lot of people that identify these opportunities. So if there's a $100 liquidation, a lot of people identify this $100 liquidation. So in the longer term, the bids that will be there are going to become closer and closer to the value of that liquidation itself. So it might end up being like a $99.95 bid that ends up winning. So whoever identified the opportunity might only make 5 cents, and the remaining value of that opportunity will go to validators and it'll go to delegators on say. So that's the approach that we think is going to win out in the longer term. And this is going to result in there being a pretty natural way for people that are delegating to say, to validators on say, to monetize in the future.
And do you foresee that this is something that's going to be built out by a third party like Flashbots, or I guess because it's in Cosmos, something like Skip, or is this something that you guys will build and ship yourself?
Right now, it's looking like it'll most likely be a third-party company that we're working with on this. We'll post more details about that in the future, but it definitely is a pretty big undertaking for us to do it all on our own, especially when we're trying to launch the core chain itself.
Yes, definitely. And now I'd love to touch on just say in the context of the whole market right now, because obviously there's a lot of layer ones out there compared to especially 2018. And developers who are listening to this might want to try to pick a layer one for them to build their businesses on. And we already see massive layer ones like Solana out there, which we've talked about a little bit, as well as upcoming ones like Aptos and Sui and so on. So can you talk a little bit about how, say, differentiates itself to developers from things like Solana, Aptos, Sway, or any of these newer chains?
So we fundamentally think that if you have a general purpose chain, then an exchange building on that chain, especially an order book based exchange, just cannot scale. And we saw this with Solana, with Serum initially being one of the most popular apps on Solana, and then afterwards NFTs and games becoming much more of a priority, and then Serum performance suffering, right? Like in Serum's case, there ended up being a bunch of issues for market makers where there was network congestion, and then market makers that had placed orders were no longer able to cancel them. So then there were like 60-second patches where like they just weren't able to get in cancel. Someone else was somehow able to get in an order, and then they got picked off. They lost a bunch of money. And we think that this kind of congestion in the other issues that I talked about before around lack of DEX optimizations and around the chains being too slow, those are just going to be plaguing all of these general purpose chains. Like even Aptos and Sui right now, their actual test nets, they're seeing closer to 2 to 3 second block times. And we just fundamentally think that whichever chain like ends up being the best fit for exchanges is going to be one that is tailor-made for exchanges, right? Like exchanges are one of the biggest applications in crypto right now. And it's one of the few things that actually has true product market fit in crypto. And as a result, the best experience on these changes or on these exchanges is going to be if they're building on top of the layer one that is specializing the layer one itself to meet their needs.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think it goes back to your point about how infrastructure in crypto will be specialized for specific verticals in the future. So it makes a lot of sense where with other chains, different applications are competing for block space across all the verticals and won't be able to keep up with what Say is trying to do.
In the longer term, general purpose chains are actually going to become less popular. That is my potentially hot take. I think that Ethereum and Solana specifically will be fine because they have a lot of developer mindshare. Specifically, I mean, in Ethereum's case, there's EVM, which is one of the most forked execution environments out there. Like half the chains out there are making use of EVM. I think in SVM's case as well, that is becoming more and more prominent right now with multiple teams like Nitro, for example, that are supporting SVM. And there's, as soon as you have this entirely different developer ecosystem that actually gets a lot of traction, then I think that ends up being a moat that'll make it much more popular of a general purpose chain. And like, I don't think that Ethereum or Solana are going to go away anytime soon, but a lot of the more general purpose chains that don't have anything unique about them, I think that the value proposition for them is going to start diminishing over time because there's going to be specialized chains like say, that are going to be tailor built for certain types of applications. And then those applications are no longer really going to see that much of a value proposition from building on a very general purpose chain that doesn't have that strong developer mode.
Yeah, and this is actually not that different of a vision that was touted by a lot of rollup proponents in the beginning, because I remember when rollups were first launched, people were concerned with composability between rollups. Like, for instance, if you have Maker and Aave on different rollups, how do you make them compose with each other? And I think the solution some people offered was that we're going to have thematic rollups, right? So a rollup just for DeFi or a rollup just for games, where a lot of games might need to talk to each other, but they might not need to talk to DeFi applications and vice versa. So do you see that as a potential challenge to what Say is doing if we see more of these like thematic rollups pop up in the future trying to do the same thing?
Yeah, so I think it really depends. So first of all, I think all these rollups that are building on Ethereum just will not be able to handle the kind of scale that is necessary for a lot of applications. Fundamentally, like Ethereum right now, if you look at the current Ethereum version of Ethereum before like they add in sharding, there's currently a limit of 15 million gas that can fit into each block. And this is every single transaction needs to be within that 15 million target block or target gas amount. And we did the math around that. Like that actually results in a max upper bound of around 6,000 TPS for all of the rollups they're building on top of Ethereum. Like that is the aggregate number of transactions that they're going to be able to handle, right? So fundamentally, that means that on the current version of Ethereum, you just can't have rollups at scale. With the sharding improvements they're planning on making in 2023, which I would be surprised if they end up happening exactly on time. Things might get a little bit better, but there's an upper bound on the number of shards that they have. And these rollups are also not going to be atomically composable with each other, so they're going to lose out on a lot of the composability benefits. So I don't think that Ethereum is going to be, at least in the next year, the right ecosystem to be building something like this on, to be building successful rollups on. And yeah, I mean, in the longer term, I think the settlement layer is going to end up mattering because once you have activity happening on these rollups, you need to bring them on chain somehow. And the place where you bring them on chain is going to matter. In Say's case, you have the settlement layer, which is also going to be where you can start trading these assets. Then you can also bridge them through IBC, which is much more secure than any other kind of bridge to other ecosystems. So I think that does end up being the benefit of building on Say or just building a chain in general, rather than building a roll up on top of Ethereum, for example.
And it makes a lot of sense. Now, Jay, for the last part of this interview, I'd love to zoom out a little bit and talk about what's in store for the future. So, first of all, I think in terms of the projects that are coming on, say, I don't know how many of these you guys can announce officially yet, but what types of projects are you personally most excited to see?
Yeah, so I already mentioned Nitro, which is one of the projects I'm excited about. Another one that I think is very interesting is UXD. So UXD is a delta neutral stablecoin that is coming over from Solana. And I mean, they're backed by Multicoin. They've already launched on Solana. And I think they're particularly interesting because of the mechanisms they're using. So rather than having like a normal type of stablecoin, they require you to put in a long position in terms of the spot asset. And then they're going to be opening a short position by using a perpetual position. So a position that they open on a perps exchange. And I think this kind of composability is not something that you really see happening too frequently. Especially, I mean, you won't really see it in TradFi, and I think in DeFi as well. It's a very interesting type of approach that they're taking to make a truly delta neutral stablecoin that doesn't need to be over collateralized. So this is another application building on Say that I'm pretty keen to see launching, and just how the community responds to that.
Yeah, and I really like how they built a product around this, because I think back in the day when most people were still using BitMEX, they only accepted Bitcoin. So a lot of traders, when they go on vacation and they don't want to have exposure to Bitcoin, they're just kind of short Bitcoin, short the amount of Bitcoin that they held on BitMEX to create synthetic USD. And I guess someone created a product out of that. So that I thought was really, really interesting. Now, just to zoom out a little bit again, in terms of the roadmap for Say itself, what can people look forward to in the next 3 to 6 months?
Yeah, so I mean, from our side right now, one thing we're trying to do is just wrapping up all of the, I guess, just becoming code complete over the next couple of weeks. After that, we're going to be getting audited, and then in ideally the next 3 to 4 months, we'll be launching. So sometime around December or January is when the mainnet launch is going to be happening. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest things that's happening. So right now, I mean, we've launched an incentivized testnet. We're going to be giving away 1% of the token supply as well as part of this incentivized testnet. So anyone that is interested in participating and, I mean, first of all, becoming part of the Say community and also just playing around with the applications that are building on Say right now, you can join the incentivized testnet, and then you'll be eligible to get testnet rewards. The other thing that's going to be happening is an airdrop. So we've already talked about certain types of users on our Twitter that'll be eligible for the airdrop, but there'll also be an airdrop happening. So I guess listeners, stay on the lookout for that, more information about that as well.
Now, finally, for people who want to keep up with what Say is working on or to follow you guys, what are the best channels for them to do this?
Yeah, so I mean, to follow me, my Twitter is Jayendra_Job. So you can follow me on Twitter. For Say specifically, I would definitely recommend checking out our website. There's links for Discord and Twitter over there. The alpha is always going to get dropped on Twitter or on Discord initially. So you should join our Discord server, and that's where a lot of the community members are having discussions, and that's where you can get most involved. And then there's also going to be more and more high-level updates coming on Twitter in the next few months as well.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for doing this, Jay. I'm super excited, obviously, both as an investor and as a potential user of the platform once it comes live. So I'm super excited for what's happening. And hopefully there are people who are listening who will now dive into Discord and learn more about the project and maybe get as excited as I am. So thank you so much for doing this, Jay. It's been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you for having me on, Jason.
All right, that's it for this week's episode of the Blockcrunch podcast. So thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe on your favorite apps. And in case you didn't know, this interview is also available as a video on YouTube. And if you tag the Blockcrunch on Twitter this week and tell us what you liked about this episode, I'll be sure to respond to you as well. Now, if you'd like to go even deeper, we have a VIP tier where every week or so, we write an in-depth research brief or investment memo on a project. And we'll have exclusive AMAs with myself where I answer all your questions as well. Now, we already have analysts from some of the top funds and companies in crypto as subscribers. So if you're serious about getting an edge in crypto, head on over to theblockcrunch.com/VIP to learn more. And once again, thanks for supporting the show, and I'll see you next week.